There are love stories that unfold in secret, behind closed doors and beneath the weight of crowns, where desire is measured not in moments, but in decades, and where a woman's patience becomes both her greatest weapon and her deepest sacrifice. In the gilded corridors of British royalty, one woman dared to love a prince when the world told her she had no right to, endured the hatred of millions who called her a homewrecker and a villain, and waited 30 years in the shadows before finally stepping into the light as queen. This is the story of Camilla Parker Bowles, the mistress who refused to disappear, who survived scandal, public fury, and the ghost of the most beloved princess in modern history to claim a crown that everyone believed she would never wear. Her journey reveals the hidden cost of forbidden love, the ruthless machinery of royal tradition, and the astonishing resilience of a woman who understood that in the game of palace politics, survival requires more than love. It requires strategy, silence, and an unshakable will to endure. Before we dive deep into this extraordinary tale of passion, scandal, and redemption, I want to ask something from you, because this channel is built on the shared fascination we all have with the hidden lives of royal women, the mistresses, the queens, the forgotten lovers, whose stories shaped history in ways we're only now beginning to understand. If you're intrigued by these untold stories, if you want to journey with me through the secret chambers and forbidden affairs that the history books often gloss over, please take just a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. We're working toward our first 1,000 subscribers, and every single person who joins this community helps us bring more of these powerful, emotional, deeply researched stories to light. Your support means everything, and I'm so grateful you're here. Now let's step back in time and meet the young woman who would become one of the most controversial figures in modern royal history, long before the world knew her name, long before the scandal, long before the crown. Camilla Rosemary Shand was born on July 17, 1947, in the immediate aftermath of World War II, into a world still rebuilding itself, still clinging to old aristocratic structures, even as modernity threatened to sweep them away. She was not born into royalty, but she was born into privilege, the kind of English upper-class life that revolved around country estates, hunting parties, and the unspoken rules of social hierarchy that had governed Britain for centuries. Her father, Major Bruce Shand, was a decorated war hero who had served with distinction, and her mother, Rosalind Cubitt, came from a family with aristocratic connections that gave the Shands access to the upper echelons of British society without quite placing them in the inner circle of the truly elite. Camilla grew up in a world of horses and garden parties, debutante balls and weekend shoots, where marriage was still viewed as a woman's ultimate achievement and where a girl's value was often measured by her ability to secure a suitable husband. She was not a classic beauty in the way that would later define royal women in the media age. She lacked the doe-eyed vulnerability that would make Diana Spencer a global icon, and she possessed instead a more earthy, confident attractiveness, the kind that came from genuine self-assurance rather than studied perfection. She was funny, irreverent, comfortable in her own skin in a way that many aristocratic young women of her generation were not, and she had a directness, a lack of pretension that would later both charm and unsettle those who encountered her. In the late 1960s, as she came of age, London was transforming. The old rigid class structures were beginning to crack under the pressure of social change. Young people were experimenting with freedom in ways their parents never had. And yet for someone like Camilla, born into a traditional upper-class family, there were still expectations, still unwritten rules about who you could marry and how you should behave. She moved through the social circles where aristocratic young men and women met, attended the right parties, knew the right people, and it was in this world, glittering but constrained, that she would first encounter the man who would change the entire trajectory of her life. The year was 1970, and Camilla Shand was 23 years old, confident, socially adept, and entering the marriage market at a time when well-bred young women were still expected to secure a husband before they became too old to be considered desirable. She had been romantically involved with Andrew Parker Bowles, a dashing cavalry officer who moved in royal circles and who had a reputation as something of a ladies' man, the kind of charming, well-connected aristocrat who knew everyone and was invited everywhere. Their relationship was on again, off again, marked by Andrew's reluctance to commit and his roving eye, which often landed on other women. And Camilla, though fond of him, was not sitting at home pining. She was living her life, attending parties, meeting people, And it was at one of these social gatherings, possibly at a polo match, though the exact details have been romanticized and disputed over the years, that she met Charles Philip Arthur George, Prince of Wales, heir to the British throne, a young man of 21 who was just beginning to navigate the impossible pressures of his position. The attraction between them was immediate, not the fairy tale love at first sight of storybooks, but something more grounded, more real. Charles was a sensitive, intellectual young man who had been raised in the cold, formal atmosphere of the royal family, where emotional expression was discouraged and duty was everything. And in Camilla, he found someone who made him laugh, who didn't treat him with the deference and distance that most people did, who teased him and challenged him and made him feel, perhaps for the first time in his life, truly comfortable in his own skin. She was earthy where he was ethereal, practical where he was philosophical, and she provided a kind of emotional warmth and acceptance that he had never experienced within the chilly confines of palace life. For Camilla, Charles represented something equally compelling, not just his position, though that certainly mattered, but his vulnerability, his need for understanding, his obvious loneliness within the golden cage of royalty. They began a relationship that was passionate and genuine, spending time together whenever his royal duties allowed, and for a brief, shining moment, it seemed as though they might have found something rare and precious, the kind of connection that transcends social barriers and expectations. But there was a problem, actually multiple problems, each one rooted in the archaic structures of the British monarchy and the suffocating weight of tradition that governed every aspect of Charles's life. The royal family in the early 1970s was still operating under rules that seemed increasingly out of step with the modern world. Rules about bloodlines and purity, about who was suitable to marry a future king and who was not. Camilla, despite her upper-class background, was not considered appropriate marriage material for the heir to the throne for several devastating reasons. First, she was not an aristocrat of sufficiently high rank. She was upper class, but not from one of the great titled families that the monarchy traditionally allied itself with through marriage. Second, and perhaps more damning in the eyes of the palace establishment, she had a romantic past. She had been involved with other men, including Andrew Parker Bowles, and in the deeply conservative, hypocritical world of royal matchmaking, a woman who was not a virgin was considered unsuitable to become queen, regardless of how outdated and misogynistic that standard was. The double standard was breathtaking in its cruelty. Charles himself was free to have relationships with whomever he chose. His romantic history was accepted as normal for a young man of his position, but the woman he would eventually marry had to be pure, untouched, a blank slate onto which the monarchy could project its own idealized image of royal femininity. Third, there was the matter of timing and pressure. Charles was being pushed by his family, particularly by his father, Prince Philip, and by Lord Mountbatten, his beloved great-uncle, to focus on his royal duties, to complete his military service, to establish himself as a serious figure before thinking about marriage. The message was clear. Camilla was a delightful distraction, but she was not a viable option for a permanent future. And if Charles wanted to marry eventually, he needed to look elsewhere, to find a young, preferably virginal aristocratic girl who could be molded into the role of Princess of Wales and future queen consort. The cruelty of this system is difficult to overstate, especially when viewed through the lens of modern sensibilities, but even in the 1970s, as women's liberation was beginning to reshape society, the monarchy remained trapped in the past, still operating under rules that treated women as commodities whose value was determined by their purity and their ability to produce heirs. Camilla understood the reality of her situation. She was not naive about the obstacles in their path, but understanding something intellectually and accepting it emotionally are two very different things. And when Charles left for an 8-month naval tour in 1972, the separation created a distance that would prove impossible to fully bridge. While Charles was away, serving in the Royal Navy and living the life that had been mapped out for him since birth, Camilla made a decision that would haunt both of them for decades and that would ultimately shape the entire tragic narrative that followed. She accepted a proposal from Andrew Parker Bowles, the charming cavalry officer she had been involved with before meeting Charles, a man who was ready to marry and who offered her security, social position, and an escape from the painful limbo of waiting for a prince who might never be free to choose her. There are many theories about why Camilla made this choice. Some believe she was genuinely hurt by Charles's absence and his apparent inability or unwillingness to fight for their relationship against the forces arrayed against them. Others suggest she was being pragmatic, recognizing that marriage to Andrew offered a safe, respectable path forward in a society where an unmarried woman approaching her mid-20s was beginning to be viewed as past her prime, and still others whisper that perhaps she was encouraged to marry Andrew by people close to the royal family who wanted to remove her from Charles's life by making her unavailable. Whatever her reasons, on July 4, 1973, Camilla Shand became Camilla Parker Bowles in a ceremony that was attended by members of the royal family and that marked, at least officially, the end of her romantic involvement with the Prince of Wales. Charles was devastated. Friends later recalled that he was deeply hurt by her decision to marry Andrew, feeling abandoned and betrayed, though he also understood the impossible position she had been in, waiting for a man who was not free to offer her any promises or security. He attended her wedding, putting on a brave public face, but those who knew him could see the pain beneath the surface, and in the years that followed, as he dutifully searched for a suitable bride under the watchful eyes of his family and the British public, he never forgot the woman who had made him laugh, who had understood him, who had provided the emotional warmth that was so lacking in his life. Camilla's marriage to Andrew Parker Bowles was, by the standards of their social class and time, perfectly conventional. They had 2 children, Tom, born in 1974, and Laura, born in 1978. They maintained a country house in Wiltshire. They moved in the right social circles. They attended the right events, and to the outside world, they appeared to be a successful, well-matched aristocratic couple. But beneath the surface, their marriage was far from the romantic ideal. Andrew was a notorious philanderer who continued his pattern of infidelity throughout their marriage. His affairs were more or less an open secret in their social circle, and Camilla, whether out of pragmatism, resignation, or her own emotional detachment, seemed to accept this as simply the way their marriage worked. There was a very British upper-class quality to their arrangement, a kind of civilized tolerance of extramarital affairs as long as discretion was maintained and public appearances were kept up, the kind of marriage that valued stability and social position over passion and fidelity. In the context of this emotionally hollow domestic life, it is perhaps less surprising that when Charles re-entered her life, Camilla did not turn him away. The exact timeline of when their affair resumed is disputed and has been the subject of endless speculation, but most historians and royal biographers agree that by the early 1980s, after Charles had married Lady Diana Spencer in that fairy tale wedding watched by millions around the world, he and Camilla had rekindled their relationship, not as a casual fling, but as something deeper, a resumption of the connection that had been severed by circumstance and royal duty nearly a decade. Earlier, Charles had married Diana in 1981 under enormous pressure from his family to produce an heir and to fulfill his duty to the monarchy. And while Diana was young, beautiful, aristocratic, and technically suitable according to the archaic rules that governed royal marriages, she was also emotionally fragile, only 20 years old, naive about the realities of royal life, and desperately in love with a husband who, as it would become painfully clear, had never stopped loving someone else. The story of Charles and Diana's marriage has been told and retold countless times. It became one of the defining narratives of the late 20th century, a real-life tragedy played out on the world stage, and at the center of that tragedy, cast as the villain by the media and the public, was Camilla Parker Bowles. To understand the role Camilla played in the disintegration of Charles and Diana's marriage requires grappling with some uncomfortable truths about human relationships, about the nature of love and duty, and about the impossible situations created when people are forced into marriages for reasons of state rather than genuine compatibility. Charles had married Diana because she was suitable, because his family approved, because she was young and virginal and seemed malleable enough to be shaped into the role of Princess of Wales. But he had never been in love with her the way he was in love with Camilla, and Diana, for all her youth and inexperience, sensed this almost immediately. There were warning signs even before the wedding. Diana later recalled finding a bracelet that Charles had commissioned for Camilla, engraved with their initials intertwined, and confronting him about it only to be told that Camilla was just an old friend, a reassurance that Diana desperately wanted to believe, but that her instincts told her was not the whole truth. The marriage began to unravel almost as soon as it started. Charles found Diana's emotional needs exhausting and her lack of intellectual depth disappointing, while Diana found Charles cold, distant, and clearly still attached to another woman. And as Diana struggled with bulimia, depression, and the crushing pressure of public scrutiny, Charles increasingly turned to Camilla for the emotional support and understanding he could not find in his marriage. By the mid-1980s, their affair was fully resumed, conducted with discretion but not with enough secrecy to escape notice by those close to the couple. And Diana, isolated and increasingly desperate, began to realize that she was competing with a ghost, with a woman who had known Charles longer, who understood him better, and who, despite not being his wife, held his heart in a way Diana never would. The dynamic that emerged was devastating for everyone involved, but particularly for Diana, who was trapped in a marriage to a man who did not love her, while the world looked on and celebrated them as the perfect royal couple. Camilla, for her part, was in an equally impossible position. She was in love with a man she could not have publicly. Her own marriage to Andrew was essentially a facade by this point, and she was forced to exist in the shadows of Charles's life, providing him with emotional sustenance while watching him perform the role of devoted husband and father for the cameras. There is no denying that what Camilla and Charles did caused immense pain to Diana. Their affair was a betrayal of marriage vows, a source of anguish for a young woman who was already struggling with mental health issues and who desperately needed support rather than deception, and the moral weight of that betrayal cannot be simply dismissed or rationalized away. At the same time, the situation was created by a system that forced Charles into a marriage he did not want, with a woman he barely knew, for reasons of duty and dynastic continuity, a system that treated both Charles and Diana as chess pieces to be moved around the board of royal obligation rather than as human beings with their own needs and desires. Camilla became the focal point of public anger, not because she was the only person responsible for the failure of Charles and Diana's marriage, but because she was a convenient villain, a woman who could be blamed and hated in a way that the beloved Diana could not be blamed, and the future king could not be fully held accountable. The narrative that emerged in the British press and in public consciousness was simple and brutal. Camilla was the evil mistress who had destroyed the fairy tale, who had broken Diana's heart, who represented everything ugly and cynical about the upper class, and their casual disregard for marriage vows and moral decency. This narrative was understandable given Diana's vulnerability and likability, but it was also incomplete. It ignored the complex realities of the situation, the impossible pressures on Charles, the hollowness of his marriage to Diana, the archaic system that had created the mess in the first place, and it reduced Camilla to a one-dimensional villain rather than a flesh-and-blood woman caught in an impossible situation of her own. As the 1980s gave way to the 1990s, the fiction of Charles and Diana's happy marriage became impossible to maintain. Their separation was announced in 1992, a year that Queen Elizabeth herself would later describe as an annus horribilis, a horrible year marked by scandal, fire at Windsor Castle, and the very public disintegration of her children's marriages. The separation made official what had been obvious to anyone paying attention, that Charles and Diana's marriage was over in all but name, and it opened the floodgates for both of them to begin speaking more openly about what had gone wrong. In 1994, Charles participated in a documentary in which he admitted to adultery, though he claimed it had only begun after his marriage had irretrievably broken down, a technicality that fooled no one and that was widely interpreted as a confirmation of his long-running affair with Camilla. Diana, feeling betrayed and abandoned, gave her own explosive interview to the BBC's Panorama program in 1995, in which she spoke openly about Charles's relationship with Camilla, uttering the famous line that there were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded, a quote that would be repeated endlessly and that crystallized in the public mind the idea of Camilla as the interloper who had destroyed their union. Diana's interview was devastating in its emotional honesty. She spoke about her bulimia, her self-harm, her feelings of isolation within the royal family, and her belief that Charles would never become king, and she emerged from it more beloved than ever by a public that saw her as a victim of a cold, uncaring royal establishment and a heartless husband who had chosen his mistress over his beautiful, vulnerable wife. For Camilla, who had tried to maintain her privacy and dignity throughout the unfolding drama, the period following Diana's interview was nothing short of hellish. She was vilified in the press, hounded by photographers, called every ugly name imaginable, and cast as the homewrecker who had ruined the most famous marriage in the world. The British tabloids, which had elevated Diana to the status of secular saint, poured all their vitriol onto Camilla, comparing the two women in the cruelest possible terms. Diana was young, beautiful, glamorous, a devoted mother who worked tirelessly for charity, while Camilla was older, less conventionally attractive, and associated with the stuffy, hypocritical world of the upper-class establishment that the public increasingly resented. The comparison was designed to humiliate Camilla, and it succeeded. She became one of the most hated women in Britain, a symbol of everything that was wrong with the royal family and their outdated values. Charles and Diana's divorce was finalized in August 1996, ending one of the most watched and dissected marriages in history, and for a brief moment, it seemed as though everyone involved might have a chance to move forward and rebuild their lives. Diana, freed from the constraints of royal marriage, threw herself into her charity work and into her role as a global humanitarian figure. She dated, she traveled, she spoke openly about her struggles, and she was adored by millions who saw her as a symbol of compassion and modern celebrity in an increasingly media-saturated world. Charles, meanwhile, gradually began to introduce Camilla more openly into his life, though they remained careful about public appearances and aware of the intense scrutiny and hostility that surrounded them. Camilla had divorced Andrew Parker Bowles in 1995, ending a marriage that had long been more form than substance, and she and Charles were finally free to be together openly, though they proceeded slowly, knowing that public opinion was still overwhelmingly against them. Then, on August 31st, 1997, everything changed in the most sudden and devastating way imaginable. Diana, Princess of Wales, was killed in a car crash in Paris, along with her companion Dodi Fayed and their driver, in a high-speed chase that was later attributed to paparazzi pursuit and the driver's intoxication. The news sent shockwaves around the world. Millions of people who had followed Diana's life felt a personal sense of loss, and the outpouring of grief was unlike anything Britain had seen in modern times. People lined the streets, left mountains of flowers outside the palaces, wept openly, and the atmosphere in the country became charged with emotion and anger, directed at the royal family for their perceived coldness in the immediate aftermath of the tragedy. For Camilla, Diana's death was a catastrophe on multiple levels. On a human level, whatever complicated feelings she may have had about Diana, the death was a tragedy that left two young boys without a mother, and Camilla, who had children of her own, must have felt some measure of genuine sorrow for that loss. On a practical level, Diana's death transformed her into a martyr and made Camilla's position even more precarious than it already was. The public grief for Diana included a strong undercurrent of anger at Charles, and especially at Camilla, who many people blamed, illogically but emotionally, for Diana's unhappiness and by extension for the circumstances that had led to her death. There were calls for Charles to renounce his claim to the throne, suggestions that he should never remarry, and absolute certainty among many commentators that he could never, ever marry Camilla Parker Bowles without provoking a constitutional crisis and a massive public backlash. In the years following Diana's death, Charles and Camilla faced what seemed like an impossible task: rehabilitating Camilla's image in the eyes of a public that despised her and gradually normalizing their relationship to the point where marriage might become conceivable. It required patience, strategy, and a willingness to endure continued hostility and scrutiny, and it is a testament to both Charles's determination and Camilla's resilience that they persevered through this period rather than simply giving up in the face of overwhelming public opposition. The strategy they employed was gradual and careful. First, Camilla began to appear occasionally at events attended by Charles, though they were careful not to be photographed together. Then slowly over time, they began to make more public appearances as a couple, each one testing the waters of public opinion, each one carefully managed to minimize backlash. Camilla also began to engage in charitable work, quietly at first, supporting causes that were less high-profile than Diana's, but that demonstrated her commitment to public service, and she avoided any direct comparison with Diana, understanding that trying to compete with the memory of the beloved princess would be both futile and counterproductive. Perhaps most importantly, she won over Charles's sons, William and Harry, who had initially been understandably resistant to their father's relationship with the woman they associated with the breakdown of their parents' marriage. Charles was careful not to force the relationship, allowing his sons to get to know Camilla gradually, and by all accounts, she approached them with sensitivity and respect, never trying to replace their mother, but simply being a supportive, steady presence in their father's life. The turning point came in 1999 when Camilla and Charles were photographed together leaving a party, an event that had been carefully orchestrated by Charles's staff to gauge public reaction. And while there was certainly criticism and negative commentary, The response was not as explosive as many had feared, suggesting that perhaps slowly the public was beginning to accept the reality of their relationship even if they did not embrace it. Throughout the early 2000s, Charles and Camilla continued their careful campaign to normalize their relationship, attending events together, being seen as a couple, and gradually wearing down the public resistance through sheer persistence and the passage of time. In April 2005, nearly 8 years after Diana's death, and more than 30 years after they had first fallen in love, Charles and Camilla were finally married in a civil ceremony at Windsor Guildhall, followed by a blessing at St. George's Chapel conducted by the Archbishop of Canterbury. The ceremony was deliberately low-key, nothing like the pomp and pageantry that had surrounded Charles's first wedding to Diana, and Camilla became the Duchess of Cornwall rather than Princess of Wales, a title that remained so associated with Diana that it was deemed too controversial for Camilla to use. Even the announcement of their engagement had included the unusual statement that when Charles became king, Camilla would be known as Princess Consort rather than Queen Consort, a concession to public opinion and a signal that the royal family understood the sensitivity around elevating Camilla to the same status that Diana would have held had she lived. The wedding was met with mixed reactions. Some people were happy that Charles had finally been able to marry the woman he loved. Others remained bitter and resentful, feeling that Camilla should never have been accepted into the royal family, given her role in the destruction of Charles and Diana's marriage. And there were protests and critical commentary alongside the congratulations. But the marriage went ahead. Charles and Camilla were finally, after decades of waiting, legally and officially together, and they began the next phase of their lives as a married couple, navigating the complex demands of royal duty and public scrutiny. As the years passed, something remarkable began to happen, slowly, imperceptibly at first. But then with gathering momentum, public opinion toward Camilla began to shift. Part of this was simply the passage of time. The intense emotions surrounding Diana's death had begun to fade. A new generation had grown up for whom Diana was a historical figure rather than a living presence. And the sheer persistence of Charles and Camilla's relationship, the fact that they had weathered the storms and remained together, began to win a grudging respect from some quarters. Camilla herself played a significant role in this rehabilitation. She approached her royal duties with diligence and seriousness. She supported numerous charities focusing on issues like literacy, animal welfare, and support for victims of sexual assault and domestic violence, and she did so without seeking the spotlight or trying to compete with the memory of Diana. She developed a reputation for being down-to-earth, good-humored, and genuinely committed to the causes she championed, and people who met her often came away surprised by how warm and engaging she was in person, a stark contrast to the cold, calculating villainess they had been led to expect from years of negative press coverage. She was also, by all accounts, a stabilizing and positive influence on Charles, who seemed happier, more relaxed, and more effective in his royal role with Camilla by his side than he had ever been during his years with Diana. The British public, pragmatic and ultimately forgiving given enough time, began to soften their stance. Opinion polls showed a gradual increase in acceptance of Camilla, and while she never achieved anything close to Diana's popularity, she was no longer the universally reviled figure she had been in the 1990s and early 2000s. I'd love to hear from you right now. Wherever you are in the world as you listen to this story, what country are you watching from and how old are you? Because I think our perspective on Camilla's story often depends on whether we lived through the Diana years or whether we're learning about this history fresh. And I'm so curious about who's in this community and where you're experiencing these royal stories from. So please take a moment to leave a comment and let me know. The question of what would happen when Charles eventually became king remained sensitive. The palace had committed to Camilla being known as Princess Consort rather than Queen Consort. But as the years passed and Queen Elizabeth II's reign continued into her 90s, there were quiet discussions about whether that promise would be kept or whether, by the time Charles ascended to the throne, enough time would have passed and public opinion would have shifted sufficiently to allow Camilla to take the title that was technically hers by right as the wife of the king. Queen Elizabeth II herself provided the answer in February 2022 during her Platinum Jubilee year, marking 70 years on the throne, when she released a statement expressing her sincere wish that when Charles became king, Camilla would be known as Queen Consort, effectively giving her blessing to Camilla's full acceptance into the royal family and overturning the earlier compromise that had limited her title. The Queen's endorsement was significant. Elizabeth II had been on the throne during the entire saga of Charles, Diana, and Camilla. She had witnessed the damage caused by her son's first marriage. She had seen the public fury directed at Camilla, and her decision to publicly support Camilla's future role as Queen Consort was both a personal statement about her son's happiness and a practical recognition that after 2 decades of marriage to Charles, Camilla had proven herself worthy of the title and that continuing to deny it to her would serve no purpose other than to perpetuate old grievances. The announcement was met with surprisingly little backlash. A few die-hard Diana supporters objected, but the general public response was muted acceptance, suggesting that the Queen had correctly gauged that the time had finally come for Camilla to be fully accepted in the role she had been preparing for, however reluctantly and controversially, for decades. On September 8, 2022, Queen Elizabeth II died at Balmoral Castle in Scotland at the age of 96, ending the longest reign in British history and marking the beginning of a new era for the monarchy. Charles immediately became King Charles III, and Camilla became Queen Consort, exactly as Elizabeth had wished. The transition was smooth, the public response was respectful, and there was remarkably little controversy about Camilla's new title, a stark contrast to the outcry that would have greeted such a development even 10 or 15 years earlier. The coronation of King Charles III and Queen Camilla took place on May 6, 2023, at Westminster Abbey, in a ceremony that was both traditional and modern, scaled down from previous coronations, but still steeped in the ancient rituals and symbolism of British monarchy. Camilla wore Queen Mary's crown, a choice laden with significance, and she was anointed and crowned as Queen Consort in a ceremony watched by millions around the world. The woman who had been vilified as the mistress who destroyed a fairy tale, who had been called every ugly name imaginable, who had been hounded by photographers and blamed for Diana's unhappiness and even for her death, was now Queen of the United Kingdom, crowned and anointed in one of the most sacred ceremonies in British public life. It was an astonishing transformation, a rehabilitation so complete that it seemed almost impossible to believe for those who remembered the hatred directed at her in the aftermath of Diana's death, and it raised profound questions about time, forgiveness, public opinion, and the nature of scandal and redemption. How did Camilla survive 30 years of scandal, vilification, and public hatred to ultimately become queen? And what does her story tell us about love, duty, and the hidden cost of royal privilege? Part of the answer lies in her own character, in a resilience and determination that allowed her to endure years of abuse and scrutiny without giving up or retreating entirely from public life. She could have walked away from Charles after Diana's death, could have disappeared into private life and avoided the continued hostility, but she chose to stay, to weather the storms, and to gradually build a life and a role for herself within the royal family despite the obstacles. Part of the answer lies in Charles's unwavering commitment to her. He never publicly wavered in his love for Camilla, never suggested that their relationship was temporary or inappropriate, and his steadfast support gave her the legitimacy and protection she needed to survive the worst of the public backlash. Without him, she would have been completely alone, but with him she had the backing of the future king and eventually the acceptance of the monarchy itself. Part of the answer lies in the passage of time and the fading of memory. As Diana receded into history, and new generations grew up without the intense emotional connection to her that their parents and grandparents had felt, Camilla's role in the breakdown of Charles and Diana's marriage became less immediately inflammatory, less a fresh wound, and more a historical fact, and this allowed people to view her more objectively and to recognize the complexity of the situation rather than simply casting her as a one-dimensional villain. And part of the answer lies in Camilla's own strategic navigation of her role. She never tried to compete with Diana's memory, never sought the spotlight, never demanded sympathy or understanding. Instead, she quietly went about the business of supporting Charles, fulfilling her royal duties, and demonstrating through her actions, rather than her words, that she was serious about her responsibilities and committed to serving the public in whatever capacity she was allowed. She played the long game, understanding that rehabilitation could not be rushed, that forgiveness could not be demanded, and that her only path forward was to be patient, to be persistent, and to let time and her own conduct gradually shift public perception. The story of Camilla Parker Bowles is ultimately a story about the collision between personal desire and public duty, about the human cost of royal tradition, and about the ways in which women, in particular, are judged and punished for participating in relationships that violate social norms. There is no question that what Camilla and Charles did caused real pain to real people. Diana suffered enormously in her marriage, and whatever one thinks about the complex dynamics that led to the breakdown of that marriage, the affair between Charles and Camilla was a betrayal that contributed to Diana's anguish and isolation. At the same time, Camilla herself was trapped in an impossible situation, in love with a man she could not have because of archaic rules about who was suitable to marry a prince, forced into a marriage of convenience with Andrew Parker Bowles, and then vilified by the public for resuming a relationship with Charles after both their marriages had essentially collapsed. She was not a helpless victim. She made choices and bears responsibility for those choices. But she was also operating within a system that gave her limited options and that judged her far more harshly than it judged Charles for the same behavior. The double standard is striking. Charles was criticized for his treatment of Diana, but he was never subjected to the kind of sustained, vicious personal attacks that Camilla endured. His position protected him in ways that Camilla's did not, and the public's willingness to forgive him while continuing to vilify her speaks to deep-seated attitudes about women, sexuality, and morality that persist even in supposedly modern, progressive societies. The fact that Camilla survived this double standard, that she endured decades of hatred and emerged not only intact but as queen consort, is a testament to a kind of strength that is often underestimated, the strength to endure, to persist, to refuse to be broken by public opinion or media cruelty. From an American perspective, the story of Charles, Diana, and Camilla has always been both fascinating and somewhat baffling. Americans have a complicated relationship with British royalty, simultaneously mocking the institution as outdated and undemocratic, while also being endlessly fascinated by the personal dramas and scandals that emerge from it. Diana, in particular, became a global icon in the United States. Her grace, her glamour, her vulnerability, and her charity work made her beloved by Americans who saw in her a kind of real-life Cinderella story, and her death provoked genuine grief across the United States, with candlelight vigils and memorial services held in cities from New York to Los Angeles. Camilla, by contrast, was never understood or accepted by most Americans in the way she eventually was in Britain. The narrative of the homewrecker who destroyed Diana's happiness was simpler and more emotionally satisfying than the complex reality, and American media largely portrayed Camilla as the villain well into the 2000s. It is only in recent years, as younger Americans have grown up without the intense emotional connection to Diana, and as more nuanced accounts of the royal family's dynamics have emerged, that Camilla has begun to be viewed more sympathetically in the United States, though she still lacks the popularity and affection that Diana commanded. The American fascination with this story speaks to deeper themes about love, betrayal, power, and redemption that transcend national boundaries, and it reminds us that even in the 21st century, people are still captivated by tales of forbidden romance and the hidden lives of those who inhabit the highest levels of society. Now, as Camilla sits on the throne beside Charles, crowned and anointed as queen, the question remains, was the wait worth it? And what has been lost and gained in the 30 years it took for her to move from mistress to queen? For Camilla personally, the answer is presumably yes. She has achieved a level of acceptance and legitimacy that seemed impossible 2 decades ago. She is married to the man she has loved for most of her adult life, and she has carved out a role for herself as queen. Consort that, while never achieving the stardom of Diana, is nevertheless respected and meaningful. But the cost has been immense: 30 years of public scrutiny and hatred, years of hiding and secrecy, the pain of watching Charles marry someone else and have children with her, the knowledge that millions of people despise her and blame her for another woman's unhappiness, and the burden of living under the shadow of Diana's memory for the rest of her life. For Charles, the price has been different but equally high: a loveless first marriage that produced 2 sons but brought him no happiness, decades of criticism for his treatment of Diana, and the knowledge that his relationship with Camilla, which he clearly views as the great love of his life, has been a source of scandal and division rather than celebration. And for the monarchy itself, the Charles-Diana-Camilla saga has been both damaging and revealing. It has exposed the cruel and outdated nature of the rules that govern royal marriages. It has demonstrated the human cost of treating people as symbols rather than as individuals with their own needs and desires. And it has shown that even an institution as old and powerful as the British monarchy cannot completely control the narratives that emerge from the personal lives of its members. The decision by Queen Elizabeth II to publicly support Camilla's role as Queen Consort was a pragmatic acknowledgement of these realities, an attempt to heal old wounds and to allow the monarchy to move forward without continuing to litigate the conflicts of the past, but it also represented a kind of admission that the institution had failed Charles and Diana by forcing them into a marriage that was doomed from the start. The story of Camilla's transformation from hated mistress to respected queen is ultimately a story about resilience, patience, and the ways in which time can soften even the harshest judgments. It is a reminder that public opinion is not fixed, that reputations can be rebuilt, and that people are more complex than the roles we assign them in the narratives we construct about their lives. Camilla was neither the pure villain that the tabloids portrayed, nor the innocent victim that some of her defenders have claimed. She was a woman who made choices, some of which caused pain to others, and who lived with the consequences of those choices for decades, enduring public hatred and private anguish in pursuit of a relationship that she clearly believed was worth fighting for. Whether one admires her resilience or condemns her actions, there is no denying that her journey from Camilla Shand to Camilla Parker Bowles to Queen Camilla is one of the most extraordinary personal transformations in modern royal history. A story that spans 5 decades and that touches on the deepest questions about love, duty, forgiveness, and the price we pay for the choices we make. She waited 30 years to become queen, 30 years of scandal and vilification, of secret meetings and public condemnation, of watching the man she loved marry someone else, and then slowly, painfully, disentangle himself from that marriage while the world watched and judged. She survived attacks that would have destroyed most people, endured comparisons to the most beloved woman in the world, and refused to simply disappear when it would have been easier for everyone if she had. And in the end, against all odds and all expectations, she achieved what everyone said was impossible. She became Queen of the United Kingdom, crowned in Westminster Abbey, with all the ancient ceremony and legitimacy that the title implies. Her story reminds us that in the hidden corridors of power, behind the public smiles and the official portraits, there are human hearts making human choices, often under impossible circumstances, and that the line between hero and villain, between victim and perpetrator, is rarely as clear as we would like it to be. Camilla's crown sits on her head now, but it is a crown earned through decades of endurance, and whether she wears it with guilt, relief, triumph, or simply exhaustion is something only she can know in those quiet moments when the cameras are off and the crowds have gone home, when she is alone with her thoughts and the long shadow of history that brought her to this unlikely throne.